Okay, welcome back. I hope everyone got a moment to sort of stretch and move their bodies a little bit. We are going to go forward, move on with our program, and I am very excited to turn the mic over to my colleague Ruth Paris from the School of Social Work here at Boston University. Ruth Paris is now the new director of the Early Childhood Wellbeing Institute. She's one of our dear colleagues who has been with us over the past year and a half planning the Institute. And I'm so lucky to have her here as the moderator for this segment. So I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, and then we will let Counselor I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, and we will let Counselor Michelle Wu get ready with her slides.
Great. Thank you so much. Stephanie, are you able to hear me now?
We hear you.
Okay, yeah. Great. I have to do a little bit of juggling with the Wi-Fi. So I am delighted to be here today and hear and read and just hear about amazing things that people are talking about and that people are doing. And I am also delighted to be introducing Michelle Wu. So I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you that Michelle Wu is a mom, a daughter of immigrants, an at-large Boston City Councilor, and a candidate for mayor of Boston. She served on the City Council since 2014 and was the first woman of color to serve as City Council president. She was the lead sponsor of Boston's Paid Parental Leave Ordinance and Healthcare Equity Ordinance, which prohibits discrimination based on gender identity and has been a voice for accessibility, transparency, and community engagement in city leadership. I'm sure that, like me, you are delighted to have Michelle Wu with us today because of all of what she's done. And I'm going to pass it to Counselor Wu.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited that this convening is happening, and just over the moon that I get to be part of it for a little bit. I know we have a period of time, and if there's space, I would like to use most of the time for Q&A, but I did have a short presentation. Is it possible if I share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay. Okay,
there you go.
Let's see. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I will just a few slides that I'll quickly zoom through. So first, I'm just really thrilled again to be here. This has been a topic, early education and care as a public good has been something that I have lived personally in the Gap as the first sitting city councilor to ever have a baby on the council, and to be part of leading the charge on some of the legislative pieces around trying to close gaps where possible, particularly for working families. In 2017, when I was serving as council president, we convened a series of policy briefings on the Boston City Council to explore different aspects of the early education and childcare landscape, with then high watermark of 4 women serving on the Boston City Council at the same time, amazingly, and thankfully we are up to 8 now today. But back in 2017, 4 city councilors who were all coming together to look at this issue from all different angles: funding mechanisms, workforce development, the transition from early education to kindergarten, cost barriers, working hours, unhoused families or unstably housed families, et cetera, et cetera. And so last month, I was proud to release my full plan to close the early education and care gap in Boston. And so I'll go through some pieces of that. But first, I want to start where Boston has made an impact nationally. And we hear about so many historic firsts in our city. One that I just cherish and want to lift up is that we are home to not only the first public school in America, but specifically the first free taxpayer-funded elementary school anywhere in America. This will be the Mather School, which is in Dorchester. It opened in 1639 to 6 students, and their education was funded through a levy on cattle grazing in the town of Dorchester. At that point, later would become part of Boston officially. And so We see various changes, right? Nearly 400 years later now, the Mather School still exists. Instead of 6 white male Puritan students, we now see more than 600 Boston Public School students, reflecting our city's racial and ethnic diversity. There's regular multilingual programming in Spanish, Vietnamese, Cape Verdean Creole. But again, nearly 4 centuries after this first commitment to public education as a public good that shaped the rest of the country, families of our youngest learners in Boston and across the country are still struggling to fill in the gap without a public education for early education and childcare. So we've seen, of course, so much devastation from COVID-19, and the pandemic has revealed the invisible costs borne by so many in our failed status quo. Underpaid workers who are essential to everyone's health and well-being. Schools have been supporting so many community needs that families have been really pushed to the limit without in-person learning, and the burden falling on particularly women and moms, caregivers pushed out of the workforce without supports. So there is truly a moment here. This polling is very recent. This comes from Data for Progress, and the ask was for what scale of public changes, policy changes are people interested in across the board in terms of all political leanings and ideology. And you can see the vast majority of our likely voters and residents across the country really have seen just how critical early education and childcare is. It is critical infrastructure. We need to fund it that way, not through one-off tweaks or small steps, but this is a moment to really think about what's possible. President Biden has also proposed a $40 billion relief package to stabilize childcare centers and offset the additional costs of operating during the pandemic. He's looking to expand federally subsidized slots for low-income families. And these are, of course, critical investments, but we are needing in this moment to plan for the long term and to make sure that we are building a resilient recovery that truly removes barriers for all families to access childcare. And again, we're seeing widespread momentum and public support for that. Just a little bit more about me. Both of my kids, I have 2 boys who are 6 and 3. They each took their first steps in Boston City Hall, although I didn't realize until later that the on-site childcare providers were very nice, and sometimes you would say, "Oh, I think they're going to walk very, very soon," but they had actually done it during the day when I wasn't there. But we are incredibly lucky and grateful that at City Hall in Boston, there's been now nearly 30 years of a commitment and an example set with on-site childcare at our workplace. As I mentioned, my first son was born in my very first year on the council. My second son was born while I served as council president. And so for several years, we were commuting together to the on-site childcare with a double stroller by bus and by subway, dropping these guys off before I would run to my offices. And yet, even with that amazing benefit, it was still a blur, right? Such a stressful period of trying to just get by until kids are old enough, that magic age when suddenly public education, public schools become an option, and the costs are gone, the time during the day. And so we need to, I'm just so determined to close these gaps and to do so with the urgency of a mother. We know that prior to the pandemic, this system was already in crisis, especially in Massachusetts. In our state, the second most expensive anywhere in the country, the average cost of childcare was $21,000 per year for infants. Low-income families qualifying for federally subsidized slots join a waiting list of 26,000 families across the state. And for parents working non-traditional hours, families experiencing homelessness, or living in childcare deserts, early education can be entirely out of reach. And I just really want to emphasize that this crisis, of course, we often talk about the burden from the perspective of families, the cost, the stress, all of these years when there's so much juggling. This crisis is just as deep for our early education and care workforce, mostly women of color, who are barely, who I don't even know if we can describe it as making ends meet. The average salary here is less than $25,000 per year, roughly a third of what an elementary school teacher earns. And so without sustainable career pathways for providers to support their own children and families, we see high staff turnover, which then again drives the cost, the instability, and our racial wealth gap. And most of all, our kids are losing out. These are the most important days and months of their development. This whole conference is oriented around that and reflected in the title, so I don't need to emphasize that to this group. But this is all around common sense, an important investment, something that we can't afford not to do. So here's a situation in Boston. This looks at the map of where the seats are relative to the population of children or infants and toddlers age 0 through 5 when Boston Public Schools sort of fully kicks in. In 2017, more than 14,000 of our youngest children lacked access to an available early education and care seat, a number that includes 74% of all infants and toddlers. And even before the pandemic, Boston had been losing licensed early education and care seats, particularly in family-based programs. The gap is particularly acute in certain neighborhoods. You look at Dorchester, East Boston, West Roxbury, Charlestown, some neighborhoods losing upwards of 20% of seats. But as you can see with this map, the gap is really across almost all Boston neighborhoods, right? That bright orange is where we see fewer than 1 seat per child. More than 80% of Bostonians are paying for the sorry, let me back up. More than 80% of Bostonians are paying more than the recommended share of income on childcare, which is 10%. For families with incomes below the poverty line nationwide, childcare ends up consuming about 30% of income on average. This is completely unsustainable. And so we see tremendous impacts preventing families, young parents in particular, from saving for home ownership or their own higher education, or pushing people out of the workforce entirely during very critical years to advance their career. So our plan, which I will put in the chat so everyone can read at your leisure, but this is an issue that is personal and urgent, and we are, again, poised to lead here. The political moment has changed, and I'm so excited to see so much progress we've discussed at the federal level and at the state level as well, where a coalition, the Common Start Coalition, has worked with legislators to file groundbreaking legislation in Massachusetts, which would cap the share of income, cap the cost of childcare to 7% per family of household income, phased in over time, as well as investing in the workforce. And so there is a chance to lean in on this, invest in childcare as critical infrastructure, but also ensure that cities are leading as well. We are proposing creating a one-stop shop for enrollment and access. There's so much that we're just not tracking or making available centrally, including where the seats are, and particularly to bring our family-based providers into this system and to be able to coordinate in a streamlined basis. We want to make sure that we are allowing for every new potential childcare entrepreneur to easily find the information and resources available to replenish these seats, and to make sure that we are truly creating a stabilized, sustainable career pathway. I'm proposing leveraging the infrastructure through Boston Public Schools to really think about all that we could do to boost training and access and technical support. We could create a program for early education and care at Madison Park, Boston's vocational and technical high school, that would expand geographic access by having on-site early education here, and again, build out this pathway. And we also want to see enforcement of existing city zoning rules that would facilitate and expand on-site childcare in commercial buildings, particularly now as we are seeing a reset when it comes to this economy and how many companies may still be working remotely or not coming back downtown in as large numbers. There's a chance to align our spatial needs as a city with some of these pre-existing gaps, and childcare would be a great way to draw businesses, employees, families back into Boston as well. This is truly a generational investment that can transform our city. We have a moment to act right now and to map out our recovery from this pandemic onto these underlying crises that we were already experiencing, putting people first, keeping families in Boston, and supporting our valued, treasured early education workforce. Okay, so this last slide is just contact information. Would love to stay in touch, and I will end it there. Would love to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Councillor Wu. I'm helping out if I need to monitor the chat or anything, so people can feel free to put questions in the chat.
Yeah, we probably have time for about 1 or 2 short questions and maybe 1 long question if someone has that one. Or 1 long question, let's just say. 1 or 2 short or 1 long.
Elizabeth, oh no, is that somebody have a hand up? Too many people to really monitor. So if you have something.
Yeah. So if you have something for the chat, that's great. Thank you for putting in your plan and for your slides as well. You have shared them with us, and would you mind if we shared them with the audience, if people would like them, a copy?
Oh, sure. There's not too much content on there, but happy to send those out if you're interested.
Okay,
Amy,
great.
Do you want to share your question?
I can read Amy's for her. Amy's question is Amy O'Leary, and her question is, what did you learn through the hearings last year?
Well, first, I feel like anything that we learn, Amy could have told us already. So thank you, Amy, for all of your leadership in this space, for the convening you've been doing, and for your feedback that has helped inform our plan and commitments as well. So I'm going to try to, when the next question is being asked, if there's time, dig out the actual report that came out of it. We did put all of our findings into one place. I mean, I think we were thinking specifically about how cities could plug into what is often described as a state level issue or federal issue in terms of the subsidized slots, as well as the licensing issues. But one point that came out over and over again really is the need and the potential for the city stepping in as sort of the centralized information hub to be able to collect data, to keep it in real time, especially to expand, to not just have our public education seats and center-based seats, but really pushing into family-based seats to be part of that same ecosystem. The city offering, the potential to play that one-stop shop role. I think we've been thinking about the need for this ecosystem, particularly as it relates to families with non-traditional working hours or geographic access, the ability to be much more nimble and flexible and to accelerate some of the access expansion that we're talking about by really leaning into so much of the entrepreneurship and energy that's already there. Incredibly talented childcare providers who either are, haven't gotten support in setting up to begin with, or could expand or have more seats available, that they, are incredibly talented providers and not necessarily marketers, or thinking about all the other aspects of that business that the city could really provide infrastructure for.
Great. Stephanie, is there time for another question?
We actually need to transition over to our next speaker. But if we might have, thank you for your answer. Amy, thank you for your question. I'm sure that there will be other opportunities, maybe sometime tomorrow, and where we will be able to talk more and ask more questions, and hopefully you'll be able to meet more people. We will have our virtual poster session where you can pop into some of the poster sessions and talk with people, as well. But we thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to transition over